Let's start with the loading spinner, and for this you can enter CSS loading spinners to find loading.io, which is a page where you find a lot of beautiful loading spinners. And I will simply grab this one, but of course you can grab whatever loading spinner you want. And I will just copy all that code here, which is the CSS code, and create a new file in the shared folder here, a new folder first of all, which I'll name loading spinner. And in there, let's add the loading spinner component TypeScript file. And important, also a loading dash spinner component.css file. And into that CSS file, copy that CSS code you just grabbed and change that white color to a color of your choice, because this is the color of the spinner and white is something you won't see. So here I will simply change that, let's say, to a nice dark blue color, but of course you can take any color you want, and replace white in all places where it occurs with that color, which should only be 2 here for this spinner at least. Now in the loading spinner TypeScript file, in the loading spinner component TypeScript file, let's export a class loading spinner component, and let's give that the add component decorator, which is imported from @Angular core. Give it a selector of app-loading-spinner, and then a template, which could be a URL pointing at an external file. But here we'll have a very short template, and I'll just grab that HTML code from the loading spinner page, which is the HTML code you need for this spinner to work. And I'll add this as my template here. Looks quite unstructured, but this is all this spinner needs to work. And thereafter, more importantly, I'll add style URLs, and there add one URL to my array of URLs, which points at my loading-spinner.component.css file I just added. With that, we prepared that loading spinner component. Of course, as always with all components, we need to declare that. So in the app module, let's add the loading spinner component to the declarations array, and make sure you also add an import path at the top of this file pointing at that loading spinner file in the shared folder. So that's the loading spinner component. We can now use this in the auth component here, because here I essentially want to hide the entire form if we are currently loading. Now to find out whether we are loading, here in the auth component TypeScript file, we can add a new property, isLoading, and we'll follow a similar logic as we did for isLogin_mode. We'll change this isLoading property dynamically and update the UI based on it. Initially, we are of course not loading, but in onSubmit, as soon as we made it past this if check and the data extraction, so right before the requests get sent, we can set this isLoading to true, because now we clearly are sending a request and we are loading. And I'll set this back to false as soon as we're done. So both here for the success case as well as the error case. In both cases, we should set isLoading back to false, because we're not loading anymore. We got a response, even if it should be an error. Now the isLoading property can be used in the template to hide the form, simply with ngIf. There we add ngIf to the form element, and by checking for isLoading, or for the form here actually for not isLoading, we ensure that the form only shows up if we're currently not loading. If we are loading, I want to show that spinner, and for that, I'll simply add a div here, and in that div, I'll add my app-loading spinner component, and that entire div will only be shown if we are loading. Now let's give this a try, and let's save that. Go back to our application, enter our data, switch to sign up, and here's our spinner. Of course, I still get my error thereafter, but the spinner works. Now, obviously, it would be nice to center that spinner, and here we can do this quick and dirty on that div by adding an inline style and setting text align to center. Of course, you could also manage this through a CSS file if you want to. This, however, should do the trick here. If we now try to sign up again, this was centered as you saw. Now, that's the loading spinner. But I also want to show an error message, an alert, in case we got an error, in case we had a problem with logging in. And therefore, the error should be handled as well. Hence, let's go back to the auth component. And we already managed whether we are logging in or whether we're loading. Now, I also want to store an error here. And initially, that is null, because initially we have no error. But in theory, that will be of type string, because it should hold an error message, let's say. Now you can get as sophisticated as you want and store more information in here, have a more complex error object, but for the UI, I only care about the message. And I either have no message or I do have a message. So therefore, let's now go to onSubmit here to the error case. And instead of logging my error message, I will simply set, or I will still log it, but I will in addition also set this error equal to an error occurred. And we'll add a more specific error message in a second. So here an error occurred is set. And in my auth component, therefore, I'll now add another div using the Bootstrap alert and alert-danger classes to give us a nice alert view. And in there, a paragraph where we output that error text, because keep in mind that the error property of this component is just a string. Now, when should this div be shown? Of course, only if we have an error. So let's add ngIf and check for the existence of error here to make sure this only shows up if we do have an error. And therefore now if you go back, you see nothing here. But if you try signing up for a user that already exists, you now see an error occurred here. This of course is better because we now give the user a hint about which error occurred, or that an error occurred to be precise, but we don't tell the user which error occurred. So that's the thing we'll do in the next lecture. Would be nice to be more specific about that error message here. Now, if you inspect the response we're getting back, you can of course see that on the response object we have that error field. And if we dig into that, there's another error field, so a nested error field. And if we dig into that, we see we have a message. That's a message provided by Firebase. And if you have a look at the Firebase REST API documentation and you scroll down a bit, you see common error codes that are thrown by that endpoint. And that would be, for example, email exists. So in the end, we just have to check for these codes and we can output a more helpful error message. Now we could do that here in our component. Here where we get that error, we could check with a switch statement, for example, if my error response, maybe we should name this error response to be more specific about what this is, because it's the full response object. And on there we have an error key, and we have an error key, and there we have a message key. We switch on that message, and then we have a case where this is email exists, for example, and now we set this error to this email exists already, for example, like this, instead of doing it like that. If we would save that code here, it already should do its job. And if I try signing up with that email address, I get the email exists already. Now we could do that here, but handling everything of that here in the component is not necessarily the best possible way of doing that. It moves too much logic into the component, which should primarily focus on updating the UI and not so much about handling the response correctly. And that therefore screams for the usage of an RxJS operator that allows us to handle errors here in the service in our observable chain we're setting up here. So on this observable. For that, we can simply pipe on this observable and add RxJS operators. And here I'm interested in one operator, and that is the catch error operator. Now, catch error needs to be imported from RxJS/operators to be available in that file. And we will also need one other thing, and that will be the throw error function from just RxJS, which will create a new observable that wraps an error. Because if you remember the earlier sections in this course, RxJS always needs to return an observable down there, and catch error catches the error, but you still then need to return a new observable, and that observable should still wrap the error so that it still ends up here in that error case in our subscription. And we do want to end up there. I just want to move more logic from there into the observable chain. And indeed, therefore, we can grab that switch statement and move it into here. In catch error, we get that same error response we previously got in the subscribe function. And therefore, in here, we can switch on that error response, error message, and set the error, though a bit differently. We can add a new variable, error message maybe, an unknown error occurred. That could be our default message in case we can't identify a more specific error. And then here I'll just set the error message to this email exists already. Now important, this switch statement here will fail if the error we're getting doesn't have that format. And that could be the case, for example, if we have a network error. So therefore here, I'll check if the error response does not, therefore the exclamation mark at the beginning, have an error key, or if it does not have an error key on the error key, to avoid that this access here fails. Because if it has either no error key or then no nested error key, then we know we can't access that message because the error we're getting seems to be in a different format. And therefore, in this case, I immediately want to return throw error and wrap my error message here. So that will throw an observable that in the end just wraps that message. Otherwise, we'll make it into the switch statement here. And there we have only one case. We'll add more cases later. Here, I then also in the end want to return throw error with my error message. So now that error message conversion logic happens in the auth service, which is a better place for that, and in the auth component, here in the error case, we now just get the error message because we subscribe to an observable here, which here in the error case will be an observable that only contains a message because we throw an error observable that just includes that message. So we know that we get the error message here as a data point. We can print it here, but more importantly, of course, we can now set this error equal to that error message. And this should now have the effect that if we go back and we try creating that same user again, we get this email exists already here, which is, of course, the same behavior as before, but now with the logic moved into the service, which is the place where that logic should be, so that our component is way leaner.